Okay.
Good evening, everybody. I am Catherine Kluver. I am the Executive Director of the Future of Diplomacy Project. I am standing in for Nicholas Burns, our Faculty Director, who is unfortunately held up in New York this evening and would very much like to be here. I want to take just a minute to thank my colleagues, Carrie Devine and Kathy Park from the Institute of Politics and the Forum Office for allowing us to bring this discussion to you and partnering with us as they always so graciously do. This could not be a more timely discussion. If we look alone at this past weekend, a partial ceasefire unraveling in Syria, an emergency meeting at the United Nations called by Russia on Saturday, and then, of course, the conclusion of a Duma election just yesterday, which comes at the end of turbulent times, shall we say, for the relationship of Russia with the West, but specifically Russia with the United States. And so I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome this group of discussants this evening. When we were thinking about who might be a perfect moderator for this discussion, Jill Doherty, who we now claim as ours since she was a Shorenstein Fellow with us in 2014 over at the Shorenstein Center, was, of course, the perfect choice. I came to know Jill as an incisive voice in her years as Moscow bureau chief for CNN, when she sat in Moscow explaining the world to us when I was in a producer's chair in Atlanta. So I am thrilled that Jill is with us this evening. Joining her on the panel is Maxim Boyko, now a visiting professor of economics at Harvard College. Some of you might be his students. In addition to his long career as an academic, he had his hand, truthfully, deeply, if you will, in the reform of the Russian economy, specifically under President Yeltsin. So I am equally happy to welcome him to this stage. And then finally, rounding out our discussion this evening is Ambassador John Beyrle, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia following a 3 decades long career, if you will, in the U.S. State Department, and was there during a very interesting time, not that there ever is a boring time at this point in this relationship, during the reset to Russia from 2008 to 2012, but has worked on this portfolio truthfully through all his years as a career diplomat in the State Department. Please join me in welcoming this wonderful panel.
Catherine, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here because this is a great panel. And I think it'll be a great audience, too, judging by previous audiences here that I've had the opportunity to be with. And also the subject, we were just saying in the green room, could not be better and could not be more apropos and timely right now. So, sometimes when you approach it, recently people have been saying, what should the next president do and what will the relationship be like, et cetera. But as Catherine began to allude to, this relationship is literally, at least some of the shorter term aspects of the relationship are changing daily. We have all of the events that she enumerated. And I would say that, by the time we get to January, whoever the president is, it will be, it could be a changed relationship, very dynamic and very fluid. So I would like to keep it very, as we say, aktualna, and keep it very actual and up to date and up to the minute. So beginning with the first question, as I was looking at the reports today, et cetera, President Putin made a comment just in the past few days saying that essentially he's very happy that Russia is the center of attention in the American election. He said, so far as the use of Russia and the president of Russia in the US presidential campaign, I want to hope this is connected with the growing influence and significance of Russia. So that's a diplomatic way of saying they're already quite involved, at least rhetorically and maybe directly, in the US election campaign. So, however, backing up, how important should Russia be in this election? Because if you go back a year or so, it didn't seem that important. And now it really is. So, John, Ambassador Beyrle, could you kick us off with that idea? You know, short term, but also long term. How important should it be?
Well, I think it probably goes without saying that the relationship between the United States and Russia for our own national interests has to be counted among the top priorities of any administration, any even presidential candidate. I mean, we're talking about two countries which still maintain the capability to do serious damage to each other through the nuclear arsenal. And that means and has always meant that the relationship between the United States and Russia is of almost existential importance to both countries and has an incredibly important global significance as well. Americans and Russians, the American and Russian governments have really an obligation to manage the relationship in the most responsible way that they can. And if we're at daggers drawn, as has seemed to be the case over the last, I don't know when you want to start counting, let's say 2, 3, 4 years, a lot of people around the world lose a lot of sleep. And some of the bad actors on the stage take great comfort in the fact that America and Russia are seem to be moving in opposite directions. Whether or not that's the actual case is something we can talk about, but that perception fuels a lot of instability in the world. So, I mean, that's just sort of a preface, and I probably don't have to make that point to this audience, that the US-Russia relationship is of paramount importance. I think what happens during presidential campaigns in this country is that there's a lot of loose talk about the US-Russia relationship. And I remember very well, I think it was in 2000 when George Bush was running against Vice President Gore, there was a great debate over who had lost Russia. Mm-hmm. Yeltsin had left the stage, Vladimir Putin had come, no one quite knew what we were dealing with, but there was a sense that there was political capital to be made by accusing the outgoing or the incumbent administration of having lost something. Just 4 years ago, during the Obama-Mitt Romney campaign, Mitt Romney famously said and was criticized for saying that Russia constituted, I may have this wrong, but it was something on the order of a global threat to the United States, or the paramount geopolitical threat to the United States. I think the important thing to remember about things that get said during campaigns, and this is understood in my understanding pretty well in Moscow, is you have to differentiate between what candidates say and what winning elected officials actually govern on. And I think there's an understanding in the Kremlin that no matter what Vladimir Trump, did I almost say that? Sorry. No matter what Mr. Trump or Mrs. Clinton might say during a campaign, it's very different than the actual construct that they'll have to govern under. At the same time, and I'll wrap up with this, I think what President Putin is making very clear now is that he is still determined to make good on that last promise that he made to the Russian people when he succeeded Boris Yeltsin back in the day, 2000, 2001. He told the Russian people, I'm going to restore order in the country. He's done that by many measures. I'm going to rebuild the economy. He got a lot of help in that, but he has managed to do that. And number 3, he said, I'm going to restore Russia's place at the head table internationally. He's still working on that project, but every time Russia is mentioned, for better or for worse, in the US presidential campaign, he takes a certain amount of credit for it, I think.
Mm-hmm. Maxim, I don't want to go way, way back, but you worked with President Yeltsin. And I think for the next president in the United States, we have to look at what are the lessons? How did we get here? What were the events or the decisions, maybe on both sides, briefly, that got us to this point that we have the worst relationship in memory, maybe, at least after the Cold War?
Thank you, Jill. Well, first of all, I probably have to preface this by saying that I don't feel like I'm an expert on foreign policy, on Russian foreign policy. even less so on US or bilateral relations. But I think that, you can understand Russian foreign policy much better if you assume, as I do, that it's largely driven by Russian domestic politics, by the economy to an extent, and by what's going on in domestic politics. I certainly find this framework useful, and I also think that there may be actually something here that has not been kind of duly emphasized or discussed. Yeah, I think it has been like a declining trend for quite a while, but the interesting question is like, cui bono, right? Who was to gain from this declining trend? I don't think that it's something that perhaps US government is very happy about, but I'm kind of two minds whether this was not actually quite consistent with what seems to work very well in Russian domestic politics. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't control that. Still, my apologies. What I'm referring to is that, obviously, Russian domestic political situation is very different from what it is in the US. There is no real competition in the political system, and that actually drives a lot of what's going on. You may, there is a view that has been kind of quite prominent recently, is that a lot of Russian foreign policy is in fact made for domestic consumption, made for TV. And I think this may be actually a refreshing angle for domestic TV, and this may be a refreshing angle to try to understand what has been happening on the Russian side.
Let me ask you, picking up on that, if you look at the relationship between the United States when President Medvedev was president compared to Putin, it raises the issue, is this Putin? Is the problem Putin in the relationship?
Well, I mean, I don't really know. I don't think Putin is the problem, nor that he's a solution. He is there. He is a fact of life. He is something that, U.S. has to reckon with. I don't think you should be expecting any changes in this regard, And whether when Medvedev was in power, it was Medvedev's policy or Putin's policy is actually an open question. I would have my kind of doubts that there was much of a change of policy. But of course, if you look at a longer perspective, the big change I think is between Yeltsin era and Putin's era, or maybe even going back to Gorbachev, right? Certainly, neither in Gorbachev, Russia kind of started opening up, or Soviet Union started opening up and becoming more of a kind of cooperative player on the international arena. And in Yeltsin's times, I would say that generally, of course, that has been in the same direction, and probably there was quite a lot of progress on that front. And that is something that we see kind of going back, and there is more and more kind of, if not quite the same feeling that there was in the Soviet Union of the kind of, fortress under siege. But something very, very, very similar when looks like there are, if you look kind of from inside Russia out, is that like, there are so many enemies out there, but then there is someone who can protect you.
Yes. So, John, if we look at, I'm trying to think of an example, an immediate example of the possibility of working together would have to be Syria. I mean, you've had very serious efforts by Secretary Kerry and Minister Lavrov to work out, at the direction of their presidents, to work out something where the United States and Russia could cooperate in Syria against terrorism. I don't want to, again, get into the nitty-gritty, but we've had inadvertent, it appears, the coalition hitting Syrian forces. The thing goes on the skids again. The ceasefire seems in jeopardy yet again. But longer term, President Obama has said that there is a gap of trust between the two countries. Is that an irreparable gap of trust? How deep is it? Can it be overcome now and by the next president?
Well, I think that if you're looking at Syria as a potential stage for better cooperation between Russia and the United States, you probably couldn't have picked a more difficult task. I think there are areas in which Russia and the United States share common interests and kind of start from a common point of procedure that are related to both countries' deep, strongest national interests that would probably offer a better chance of reestablishing some kind of more beneficial or cooperative relationship than the one we've kind of backed ourselves into now. You were talking earlier about whether or not the problem is President Putin in response to the collapse of the reset, as some people have talked about it. I was ambassador during most of the reset period, 2008, 2009 to 2012. And the reset really was made possible because we had a new US president, which allowed the Russians to turn the page. And we had a new Russian president who was given a bit of license, a bit of running room by Vladimir Putin to try to build a different kind of relationship with the United States, and it produced some results. It produced the START Treaty, it produced the 3 or multiple visas that a lot of people probably have on their passports now, Russia joining the WTO. We've had these periods of cooperation in the US-Russia relationship before. In fact, it's hard in some ways to think of a great power relationship that the United States has had with any other country that has been marked by the oscillations, by the cycles of ups and downs that we've had with Russia. So the problem with those periods of cooperation, whether it is called peaceful coexistence or détente or the reset, is not that they don't produce results, it's that they don't last. It's very hard to sustain them. So back to your question about the possibility of a less confrontational relationship with Russia, I would say that the new administration needs to make it a priority to build a more sustainable long-term strategic relationship. I'm not saying strategic partnership, I'm saying strategic relationship with Russia in which we focus on the areas which matter most to us. And I would put at the top of that list not Syria, not trade and investment, but the nuclear relationship, for the reasons I alluded to at the beginning. This is the main existential question between the two of us, the two countries, and unfortunately the taboo about using one's nuclear power as a kind of bragging point internationally has been broken over the last 3 or 4 years. We didn't have this under President Yeltsin. We didn't have it under Brezhnev. But we have had President Putin boasting about Russia's nuclear might as an attribute of national power in a way that should give us all pause and should make the new administration want to focus on restoring the habits of cooperation that we built with the Russians over 20, 30, 40 years of an arms control process which produced results. So, long answer to your question, but the short answer is we definitely have areas in which we must, in which we can cooperate. We need to build on those areas and not put all our eggs in baskets like Syria, which are extremely difficult right now.
Jill,
Yes.
am I allowed to ask a question?
Oh, of course.
That's not my prime role, but actually...
Don't outnumber me.
No, but what I wanted to ask is that if you could expand a little bit on the nuclear part of the relationship, because I think it's very important. Let me ask the following question, is that indeed there were some very, how shall I put it, very widely discussed comments that President Putin has made about kind of, how Russia is now changing its nuclear doctrine, etc., which may all be quite worrisome. But has there been any kind of actions, any kind of hard things that have started changing on the Russian side, like, bite rather than bark, that you can point to?
There are probably a number of people in this audience who are far more qualified than I am to answer that question. I think the bigger problem is bark, not bite, because most people don't immerse themselves in the details of, or really wouldn't understand the details of modernization of the Russian nuclear arsenal. But it is very easy to understand a Russian leader who boasts about the fact that, or I'm thinking of another senior Russian official who boasted of the ability of Russia to reduce the United States to rubble. That is, again, a taboo that I was very sad to sort of see broken. And to me, that's probably a more dangerous thing than the actual nuts and bolts of how the Russian nuclear arsenal has changed, because really I think our own deterrence, our own ability to counter that threat is as strong as it's ever been.
I don't want to get too personal, but there are two candidates, and they're quite different, for President of the United States. And they have very different approaches to dealing with Russia.
Two leading candidates.
Two leading candidates, that's true. I can't forget the third-party candidates. But, you know, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton have very different approaches, it would appear, to dealing with Russia. I'm interested in Donald Trump's kind of personalization of the relationship. He seems to believe that Vladimir Putin is a man that you can kind of do a deal with. That's maybe question mark, Maxim, whether you agree with that. And Hillary Clinton, for a number of reasons, probably will have to look very strong, perhaps macho would be the word, if she were to be president. You know, Democrat, woman, et cetera. Where do you see the relationship going? Again, short term because of the presidents that we could have, or long term, could the relationship be different regardless of who the president is? But let's start with Donald Trump. I mean, does he really believe he can do a deal? And do you, as an observer and a person who comes from Russia, think a deal can be done on the relationship to improve it with Vladimir Putin?
Well, it's very hard for me to comment on Donald Trump, but let me say this, that I do believe that for Vladimir Putin, the kind of the personal aspect of relationship is actually quite important. And we know that, you know, for instance, in Europe, he would have a kind of better relationship with this or that leader, and that seemed to have had some effect on bilateral relationships as well. However, I think that this should not be overestimated. I think that ultimately it's kind of if we are thinking kind of beyond the short term, beyond the kind of what can be achieved today, but if you think about strategic things, I don't really think that is something that could be a kind of, you know, a insurmountable obstacle if the relationship is not there, or that a relationship can kind of change everything dramatically. I think it's really, for me, it's more of a matter of what kind of, what are the areas where the relationship would be improved? How can the two kind of interests can be more aligned with each other? And I think that starts with a better understanding the other side. And when I say understanding, I don't mean it in the sense of kind of, you know, sympathizing, saying, well, you know, we need to recognize Russia's spheres of interest, this or that. I think this is just an understanding of strategic objectives and what it is that the other side needs from this relationship at a very fundamental level. So I would say that whoever of the two candidates can do this better would have a better deal, will have a better chance of improving the relationship and achieving progress in this area. Not the one who thinks that, you know, I can be more personable and strike like some sort of personal deal.
Mm-hmm. John, so understanding the other side, what does Putin want, both in his neighborhood and internationally?
In a word, Putin wants respect. The whole narrative of the 16 years of Putin's hold on power in Russia has been an effort to redress a lot of what are perceived as the wrongs that were done to the Soviet Union when it fell apart, and to Russia as the successor to the Soviet Union. And there was I think a tremendous list of grievances, I recall, that President Putin in his first meeting with President Obama laid on the table for about 45 minutes. And I don't sort of need to relitigate what those are. But it is very, very clear to me that President Putin and the people around him, his closest advisors, the foreign policy establishment, sort of epitomized by Foreign Minister Lavrov, want to regain the ability of Russia to have a decisive say on the major international issues of the day. And they feel that they lost that right, which they got used to during the Soviet period, in the 10 or 15 years after the Soviet Union broke apart. And they are determined to restore that, to recapture that for Russia. So the question of what Putin wants in the neighborhood is a pretty hard question. Well, in some ways it's not a hard question to answer, but I'm not sure it's the question we need to ask. I think you started out by talking about the two candidates and what their policies would be. I have to say honestly, I cannot discern any kind of coherent foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia out of Mr. Trump. I'll just say that, put my cards on the table. I think Secretary Clinton, by contrast, has a pretty well-defined foreign policy program which has been spelled out. And the point I would make is that the idea that the things that Mr. Trump says are pleasing to the Kremlin, that's true in the case of what he said about NATO. Nothing would give the leadership in the Kremlin more solace than to see America withdraw from its responsibilities in NATO. And obviously anything nice that's said about Vladimir Putin on the public stage in the United States is a net plus, because he has a 60 to 70% disapproval rating among the American people. But the idea that the Russian leadership would be happier with Mr. Trump as opposed to Mrs. Clinton, I think is wrong. I've talked to some of the advisors of President Putin on the foreign policy side, whose job it is to explain to him what's happening in the United States. And they, to a man, because there aren't any women there, to a man would much prefer to deal with the known quantity of Hillary Clinton than the unknown, unpredictable qualities of Mr. Trump.
You know, we have about 5 minutes left, and Maxim, I know your brief is economics. So, you know, let's get kind of Marxist about this and say that the economy, you know, you're defined by the reality of the situation. And the reality of the situation in Russia is that the economy is not doing well, correct? So that always raises that issue of why do you have, and I'm going to use a word, it's not my word, but it's used by critics of President Putin as adventurism in certain areas, you know, close to Ukraine, et cetera, Crimea. And this, in turn, is built into the threat from Vladimir Putin. Who knows what he's going to do next? But isn't he hobbled by the economy from doing some of these more adventurous things or not? And I'll say this because you said it's all, ultimately comes back, a lot of it, to domestic politics. If Russian citizens are being hurt by certain actions that are taken abroad, witness the sanctions because of Crimea, why would he do things internationally that would hurt him, apparently, hurt him at home?
Well, I think that the short answer is because they don't. I think that if you look at the net result of Crimea, and I'm in no way saying that this went kind of exactly as planned, but indeed what you have as a result of Crimea is international sanctions and kind of a completely different, I would say, view of Russia on the international arena, but it was also a moment when Putin's population skyrocketed. Basically, you know, if you economists, they always talk about trade-offs, right? So what he traded off was a certain percentage decline in GDP as a result of sanctions, and perhaps a larger percentage as a result of the oil price going down, which is not exactly related to what happened at Crimea, but the Spern popularity, where his ratings shot up from something like 60 and there was a declining trend, to something like 80, his popularity ratings. I think this is something that might have been a pretty good compensation. And in fact, I think answering this question more generally, indeed, when things are not going very well in the economy, and they are not, and when the expectations are pretty low, that it's not only that it's not going well now, and actually some of the recent economic indicators remain pretty bad. I don't want to throw too many numbers, but like some of the numbers released today show that, for instance, real income of the population are now down by about 8% on a year-by-year basis. But that actually may pull you into more kind of adventurous policy abroad, because that's kind of, that looks very well on TV. And I would say that particularly if we're talking about things other than the kind of what in Russia is called near abroad, rather the countries, ближнее зарубежье, right? The countries around Russia, this is exactly where you want to have, some kind of positive noise, but controlling your risks, not taking too many risks, because ultimately the goal of all this is to kind of, remain politically stable and consolidate political stability.
I see we're almost at 6:35, which is what we decided is the magic moment that we would turn to questions from the audience. And there are a whole lot of more things that we could get into, but Catherine, maybe you'll lead us into the questions from the audience.
I absolutely will. We wanted to very much liberate Jill from her oath that she has taken as a now recovering journalist, and very much bring her into the discussion with all of you. So I've stepped up here to lead our conversation for the rest of the roughly 40 minutes that remain. I should add that Jill is a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. So she has dedicated her time since she left here in the Shorenstein Center to writing a book about Vladimir Putin and thinking specifically about the man and the policies. So that's why we wanted very much to include her in this conversation. This is the forum. Many of you will, since this is the beginning of the semester, might not be as familiar with the ground rules that we have here. But we have 4 microphones, 2 on the ground floor, 2 up here on the little balcony. We would ask for you to go ahead and feel free to line up with your questions. Keep your questions brief, and the most important thing here in the forum is that they do end with a question mark, so no long speeches. And we're going to start right over here.
All right, so as you can tell, I'm eager to ask my question. One of my friends'
Could you just introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, my name is Andrew Kingsbury. I'm an extension school student. You might be familiar with Ambassador Ian Kelly. He's the ambassador to Georgia. You might have crossed paths with him.
Yeah, he's a good friend of mine. For 30 years. He's
a friend of mine's father, and on Facebook today he posted shared a New York Times article about Russia Today, RT America, which you guys might be familiar with. It's a state-funded network funded by Putin or Russia, the Russian government, allowed to function here in the United States. And the article seemed to insinuate, and I agree, that it creates like Putin sympathizers, I guess, and seeds a lot of doubt, I guess, in our political discourse, as well as 9/11 conspiracy theories. So I just wanted to see what you guys think of that network, if it has any negative impact on our discourse, especially with General Mike Flynn being a regular contributor and inner member of Trump's inner circle and everything.
So that question was somewhat directed to Ambassador Beyrle, but I'm going to let Jill lead this off as a former member of the media working in Moscow and observing the media landscape there.
You mentioned one person, an American who, General Flynn, I guess it is.
General Mike Flynn.
Larry King as well, who used to
Larry
be
King
with
and Ed
CNN.
Schultz was in this article.
There are some, and a lot of the anchors are young people, Brits, Americans, etc. So it looks like a regular television network. It is not. It is funded by the Russian government. I would say it's quite different from the BBC, however. But you probably know about this. If you're here, you've probably heard of RT, maybe you even watch it. A very brief history of RT is when it was founded, it was called Russia Today. There still is Russia Today, but it's an overarching concept. But it was called Russia Today, and they very quickly realized, and this was told to me by the head of RT, that nobody at that point, 10 years ago, was really that interested in Russia. Cold War is over. And so they had to rebrand, and they rebranded to RT. And their mission right now is to appear like everybody else, kind of another version of BBC, CNN, whatever, international broadcaster. I do believe, and this is the subject that I've looked at really intensely with great interest over years, is that Russia, unfortunately, does not have a message, a soft power message that is cohesive for the world. Like, what makes Russia tick? What is Russia's contribution and maybe suggestion to the world of how we can all kind of interact? So what they do in lieu of that is they undermine people who do have some type of message. And I do not think, sometimes I feel like an old cold warrior, and I believe me, am not. But I would say their mission right now is to undermine and attack America's version of democracy, or let's call it Western democracy, and the belief in Western governments that democracy can work and the government can work for people.
Our leaders are all corrupt, basically.
It's because everybody lies. Everybody lies. Maybe we lie, but the Americans lie too. And everybody lies. This is all in quotes, is to undermine faith in really anything. And that is very dangerous. It's very nihilistic. And I think that unfortunately, it works in the context of social media. So I'll leave it at that, but they've morphed, and they've morphed in a really bad direction.
Does that read out the same way for you, Maxim and John, or do you see nuance there?
Look, I think there's a great competition for the attention and the education of people around the world. And frankly, as disgraceful as I think some of RT's broadcasts are, I think they're also very effective at doing what the Kremlin wants them to do, exactly what you described. I haven't read the article that you talked about, but if there's a suggestion in there that the response to all of this is that we should find a way to ban or stop RT from broadcasting, I hope that's not what the article is proposing, because obviously that's not what we stand for. We need to keep our values as strong as we can, even when those values are under attack.
Thank you.
All right, we'll go over here. Please introduce yourself.
Shri Kulkarni. I'm a mid-career master's in public administration. So it seems that some of our policymakers are of the camp that if you give Putin an inch, he'll take a mile. Like, look what happened in Crimea. Others are of the camp, well, if you try to aggressively stand up to Putin, you're just going to increase tension and further the possibility of hot confrontation. Look at Donbass. So in your opinion, in what cases is standing up to Putin positive for international economic and political stability, and in what cases is it counterproductive?
So contain, engage, engage, contain. Maxim, since the economic component came up, why don't you start from there?
Indeed, I think many of the recent Putin's foreign policy actions have looked quite adventuresome and quite probably startling and unexpected. I mean, I can speak of myself. I certainly did not expect Crimea. I did not expect Syria. But at least if you look at them with some hindsight, I think there is an important difference, is that we probably are not going to talk a lot about kind of the near abroad and what's going in Ukraine, but I think this is very different from the way Russia behaves in kind of more distant areas, including Syria. I think that overall, kind of, again, thinking about Putin's strategic interest, of course, it's not to destabilize situation in Russia. It's for something that, yes, kind of creates some problems, etc. But I think there's a kind of limited risks that he's prepared to take, in kind of particularly vis-a-vis United States. So I think that it should not be overestimated how dangerous all of this is, because again, ultimately, there has his interest in that of being stable inside Russia, and there are limits how far he could go.
Maybe it takes it on the political side further to looking at what we can do as the West writ large, or as NATO allies specifically. I mean, that's
Well, I mean, as someone who is a diplomat for 30 years and is in the presence of some of his great mentors, you won't find me arguing against engagement in this or almost any other case. But in this particular case, it's especially important. You simply cannot leave Vladimir Putin, you cannot leave the Russian military and security establishment to their own devices. You need to try to establish a way of talking with them, if only to force them to answer for what we see them doing around the world that we disagree with. That's one of the reasons that I think this administration went a bit too far in cutting off some of the channels of communication as a result of the Crimea annexation and the mischief in southeastern Ukraine. As indefensible as those actions by Russia have been, it really, to my mind, raises the stakes and raises the importance of maintaining some sort of dialogue with Russia. Dialogue is a word like appeasement that's beginning to take on a kind of smelly tone to it. But by engaging with the people who you see creating problems in the world, you put yourself in a position to mitigate against the problems that are being created. By not engaging, you simply cede the field.
Can I chip in here? I think there is one important nuance that I would like to emphasize, John, and this is that there is a little bit of a difference, maybe actually an important difference, in how decisions are made in US and in Russia. And I think that has some practical importance, particularly in foreign policy. I think that the foreign policy making is extremely personalized. So I would definitely agree that there has to be kind of more dialogue, etc. But I think that American side should also keep in mind that the key decisions are actually made by Mr. Putin himself. So you can achieve only so much by talking to foreign policy experts, etc. It's really very, very different, because here, or I don't know, in any, let's say, developed Western country, you will have, kind of think tanks, you will have a dialogue about foreign policy, then something else may be implemented. That happens as well. But still, there would be some, coherence, some rational development, etc. I think that what we are seeing from Russia is that all these decisions are actually taken by one person. And unless you are talking to someone who is really engaged with him in this discussion, I believe there are very, very few people who are. You may be kind of not getting much less far than you believe you are. Having said that, I think that also emphasizes how important it is to have this dialogue at the very high level, because I think this is where kind of actual business can be transacted much more successfully than at other levels. And this would be very different from what you can achieve, I think, with other countries.
Just very, very briefly, because we have a lot of people here, I agree with a lot of what you said. The discussion at the top is irreplaceable almost, but let me give you a very quick example of a lower level relationship that absolutely must exist, and that's between the heads of the military establishments in Russia and the United States. In 2008, after Russia and Georgia fought their war, the fact that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the US side was able to call his counterpart on the Russian side and explain the military moves that America was making in response to that, to forestall misunderstanding, was absolutely crucial. And that relationship, that level of dialogue, discussion, really doesn't exist now between the respective heads of those two entities. And that's a very dangerous thing.
Go ahead.
My name is Glenn Shaw. I'm a second-year student at the business school. How would you say that Russia and the US's relationship has changed or morphed over the past couple of decades with the rise of China? And how do you think China's continued rise might impact this relationship going forward?
Question.
I think Maxim is good.
Yeah, I was just going to say, do you want to talk
Maxim?
about the new Silk Road and where is it going?
Well, that's a little bit hard to say, but I think, Russia may feel jealous that it's kind of, there is competition from China, but I think that since this is a question about kind of U.S. Relationship with the two countries, maybe it would be better for Jill or for John to pick it up.
Well, it's always, very quickly, it's
Yes.
always safe to quote Henry Kissinger on this subject. Kissinger said that the U.S. needs to aspire to have a better relationship with Russia and with China than Russia and China have with each other. That's a bumper sticker, but there's a lot of wisdom in that. And I think the idea that Russia and China somehow are on a path to form an inevitable axis of power against the United States fundamentally misunderstands the interests that both countries have in their shared neighborhood.
I agree.
And I would just jump in. I think John is absolutely right. After sanctions, and I was in Moscow at that period, the Russians decided to, refer to China as the alternative to the West. There was a lot of this, well, we don't have credit cards anymore from the West, but we can have Chinese credit cards. And China will, be our buddy in the world, and we can certainly stand up to the West. That has not panned out. There have been some deals, but I think Maxim would know all the details a lot more. But rhetorically, it's been very useful for Russia to refer to China. But in reality, I think the Chinese realize that the Russian economy simply is not that on the level of anything in the West that it really has to deal with. And I think the Chinese have a very long game. Russia right now, I'm not quite sure where their game is going, but it feels pretty short term, and China does not. So I guess I'll leave it at that, but I would say it sounds good.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that, of course, there have been a lot of high-level effort on the Russian side and perhaps on the Chinese side to kind of, promote trade and investment, etc. But the facts are the other way, that trade is going the other way. I think that the trade has actually been going down over the last couple of years, maybe primarily because of the change in the price of oil, but it doesn't seem that there is at least a strong economic footing.
Well, and geostrategically, they remain competitors in critical areas, not least for the economic component in the Arctic and access to maritime pathways that way.
Right.
So, this is the tip of the iceberg of this conversation, but something.
Just remember that in the long arc of Chinese understanding of their history, Russia's presence in what's called Outer Manchuria,
Correct.
To include the Russian Far East, is a relatively recent phenomenon.
Very true. Go ahead.
I'm a student a graduate student at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. And I guess I'm going to play a devil's advocate here a little bit. The Soviet collapse, which Putin has called the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, in a phrase that's very often placed out of context in Western analysis of Russia. Since then, Russians have seen regimes collapse across the world, often with very heavy US involvement. We talk a lot about Russian propaganda and how Russian TV is brainwashing Russians into being anti-Western and so on. But to what extent do you think this fear of instability in a country whose president since 2000 has built his support on a narrative of stability and order, to what extent do you think that fear of instability is actually genuine in a country which is still seriously reeling from the Soviet collapse? And what mistakes has the West done towards Russia in actually exacerbating that narrative?
Some of the cohesive qualities one of the presidential candidates admires greatly. Jill.
Yeah, this is almost a philosophical question, I think. I think it gets back to some of the early things that John was saying about respect. I do believe, and I go to Moscow a lot, and I do believe that people feel that regardless of what Putin is doing, And some people do not agree with what he is doing, either domestically or internationally. They still believe that Russia is back on the stage, is getting respect, and as some Russians have said to me, they may not love us, but they fear us. And that is, to me, a very, kind of Russian approach. People fear / respect Russia for at least being in the game and holding its own. And that's very, very important. Russians feel that they were demeaned at the end of the Soviet Union, and I think that's what Vladimir Putin was talking about. I agree with you that that has been misinterpreted mercilessly. He was not really saying, I want to rebuild the Soviet Union. But he was saying that something, this cohesive, this unity that they are trying to engender right now is very important to building some type of cohesive nation. So it's a very, I think, just my feeling, countries exist on myths about themselves. And that's sometimes as important as the nitty-gritty, realistic things. Russians are very proud. They criticize themselves, but they are very proud people. And if we do not understand that, we will continue to exacerbate the situation with Russia, I believe.
Well, we've just concluded the Duma elections, and we were talking earlier about the low turnout, but maybe, Maxim, you'd like to weigh in on the narrative that gets to this question, the narrative and how that fueled or didn't fuel the conversations on and around and finally into the ballot box.
First of all, I think that there were two kind of pieces of news from the Duma election. Kind of talking in very broad brushes. One is that indeed the United Russia Party got probably many more votes than everybody expected, and even more so, many more seats. So I think the three numbers that I have in mind is that their popularity, their ratings are at around 40%. With this 40%, they somehow managed to get 54% of votes kind of in competition with other parties, which was quite good. But ultimately, they got about 3/4 of the Duma seats. That's how the arithmetic of the election worked, because they actually were very successful in kind of winner-take-all, in putting forward winner-take-all candidates where they just had to be stronger than the other candidates, but not perhaps get an overwhelming majority. So we're basically almost back in the single-party system, It's complete control. But that's probably not the most important message from the election. I think that a more important message, for me at least, relates to the very low turnout, which actually is the lowest, I think, in the new history of Russia. If you start from 91, of course. In the Soviet days, we had like 90% plus turnouts, which don't mean a lot. Now I think it was just under 50% on average, but this average actually is combined of two very uneven parts. There are like 90 or 80+% elections in the Caucasus, etc., participation, I mean. But in large cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, I think Moscow is below 35 and St. Petersburg is below 20%. Mm-hmm. So it looks like the voters got really, and you were inviting me to talk in Marxist term, alienated, which is a Marxist term, from the political system, which basically, it's just not an election that matters. It's not an election that people got involved in, which is actually very, very sad, because that's a clear, for me, that's an important signal that the population understands that the kind of political system moves internally, away and away from them.
Separate from them.
And to get back to your question about the perception, President Putin's reaction to this, his explanation for the resounding victory of United Russia, it's a reaction of the Russian people to foreign pressure against Russia.
Go ahead.
Yes, hi. My name is Josh Rubinstein. I'm an associate at the Davis Center for Russian Studies. In the wake of the refugee crisis in Europe, there's a growing appeal of authoritarian political parties and that's reflected in elections that are taking place and are likely to take place soon. Russia is seen as meddling in that and encouraging the rise of these parties in various ways. Is there anything the United States can do to counteract that influence?
When it's not being meddled with in its own electoral system, perhaps. John, we were just talking about this earlier, so.
Well, I don't think that Russia is really actively trying to influence the outcome of the election in this country. I think the probable cause for the meddling that we've seen is simply the ability to say, your system isn't so great either, buddy. And you've been meddling in our politics in Russia long enough, now we're going to give you back what you've given to us. That seems fairly primitive, but I think it goes a long way to explaining what we see happening and what people are trying to understand about the Russian influence in our own election. With regard to the European elections that you're talking about, there's no question at all that Russia is very, very active, especially in the former states, the former Warsaw Pact states, the former Soviet satellite states of Central Europe, in trying to support these right-wing parties and often populist parties, which also have, I would say, probably more affinity for the Russian style of governance than the local side. What we in the United States can do about that is simply be present, be more active in Central and Eastern Europe through our own visits by senior officials, through our own programs, through USAID, other foundations, in trying to help those countries still strengthen what is a very fragile and kind of nascent democracy that's been built up over the last 20, 25 years. It is far from established, and the idea that we can sort of just pack up and focus on other parts of the world, I think, is illusory.
Go ahead.
My name is Steve Laperouse. I have just come recently from 2 decades in Moscow. And the topic this evening is the crisis with Russia, but it seems to me that we've been speaking a little bit sort of too abstractly about, can you hear me? You've been speaking a little bit too abstractly about the question of the crisis. If I were to try to speak from the Russian point of view, I would say, for example, remember, let's go back a couple of years, Sochi. That was a big, Russia was on the world scene. It was successful, more or less. But from that point, everything has been going down. From the Russian, inside Russia, the point of view is, okay, the Ukraine happens. Now, whatever you think about Ukraine, the Russian people are absolutely convinced that the US government led to the overthrow of the Ukrainian government. Whether it's true or not, that's what they believe. So, and this has led to families being destroyed, people being killed, the country being divided, all of the story with Ukraine. So then, also you have to realize, getting back to the question of the facts of the...
your question very soon.
I'm getting there, but I have some important things to say. So the point is that, for example, sanctions. The sanctions that the West put onto Russia affected the lives of every single living Russian, and it happened within 4 weeks.
Right. Some of those things we've picked up. We're really curious about what your question is now.
Okay, so I'd like to hear I'd like to hear people speak about some of the more realistic elements of how the future president can address the actual crisis aspects of life in Russia for the Russian people.
Jill, because you weren't able to weigh in on that because you were the one asking the questions earlier, I'm going to let you take that first.
I really don't think that the United States can do a whole lot. I mean, the purpose of the sanctions, was a reaction to what happened in Crimea. Now, I think the price of oil has had probably a more significant impact on Russian citizens. And the people that you speak to, when you really get down to it, some of them understand that quite well. But one thing that goes on in Russia, and if you live there for 2 years, I think you know that. 3 years. So 3 years, is that what's the option? You have President Putin. He's better than Yeltsin because he is stronger, he doesn't drink, he is, respected on the world stage. And so you kind of accept. But Maxime is pointing out something that is significant. The turnout in this last election was low in these big cities where people are more educated and exposed to what's going on in the world. That is not a good sign for Vladimir Putin. What does it mean for the future? Maybe nothing. Maybe people retire to their kitchens and continue to discuss this. But I think there is growing dissatisfaction, but not a place to put that dissatisfaction.
No, I think this is exactly right. That if I may again chip in here, is that if there is no kind of real political competition inside the system, these things they just they keep accumulating, but there is no way for them to get out if there is some dissatisfaction. On the other hand, of course, that means that there is the capacity to kind of withstand this pressure is much stronger, right? Mm-hmm. So even if the economy is not going to do very well, at least my forecast would be that this would not create any immediate political problems for Putin, certainly not in the short or medium term.
Mm-hmm. We've got about 8 more minutes for a discussion that could go on for the remainder of the night, so we're going to take the rest of this round of questions and then wrap it up. Go ahead.
I'm Rachel Van Horn. I'm also a master's student at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. And Ambassador, you mentioned that the relationship between Russia and the United States has sort of had this up and down kind of cyclical, I guess, quality to it. And I can't help but think that maybe the United States might be guilty of engendering that kind of relationship simply because it seems like often Russian specialists or funding for Russian specialists goes in and out of fashion. And I think I just wanted to get all of your perspectives on what ways we can better, I guess, empower Russian specialties and maybe create a more educated civil service in Russian-Eurasian relations.
It's a good question. It's something I worry about a lot, frankly, and I worry about it a little less when I see a full audience like this. Interestingly, I have a friend who's head of the Russian department at George Washington University in D.C. He said the Russian language sections in the linguistics department are full again for the first time in many years. That's a good sign. The bad news is that we don't have the structure for sustainable funding that we had for that. I'm talking about government funding under the Title VI and Title VIII programs. That's largely evaporated or gone elsewhere. And I think we need seriously to have a discussion about why it's important to continue to build that cadre of people like Jill and me who went to school in Leningrad in the 60s and 70s, were on US information exhibits in the 1970s and 1980s, and have, we may not understand everything about Russia, but we understand more than the average American does. You need to invest in that, and I feel we're not investing in that now. I work sort of part-time in my retirement years on the board of a foundation called the US-Russia Foundation, which is looking very much at ways to continue that support for the kind of Title VI and Title VIII educational programs and their counterparts on the Russian side to bring Russians to the United States, because there's another side, obviously, to the equation that they need to understand us better as well.
Jill, did you want to add to that?
I just think the recent Russian decision to end some exchange programs is very sad. John and I both were good examples of government funding in the 1960s and 70s that sent people to, I got a fellowship when I was a student in college to study in Leningrad. And it changed my life, and I think it's always made the difference in trying to understand what the Russians want. Right now, we don't have that. And unless you are there and you meet with people from both sides, the Russians have to come here as well. But it's crucial. Sometimes people, it sounds soft. It sounds, a little airy-fairy, but it's not at all. A whole cadre of people who work in the government, including John and many other ambassadors, came from that opportunity that we were given at the end of the 1960s because of the space program and Sputnik to do something. Well, it's just as serious times as it was with Sputnik, I think, right now. And the government, U.S. government ought to be doing something and take this seriously.
It's a much harder sell in Congress now.
Yeah, well,
Much harder.
to their own, as they would say in Russian, zrya, you know, it's to their own detriment.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jacob Link. I'm a sophomore at the college, and my question is about the future of Western business involvement in Russia. In that, following Crimea sanctions and the drop in the oil price, Western companies with substantial business interests in Russia have taken, understandably, a pretty substantial hit. And in light of all that's happened, and uncertainty about the future, uncertainty about potential adventurism, as it's been said, on the part of the Russian government, what are Western companies with interests in Russia or looking to have interests in Russia going to have to expect for the future?
Yeah, Maxim, a question for you. With the contraction of the Russian economy, 2 years of recession, what does that spell?
Well, I mean, I think that doesn't spell anything good. That there was not enough business. Unfortunately, we have to recognize that there is neither trade nor enough investment to provide kind of, you know, a firm economic floor for bilateral relations. That's just a fact of life. I mean, that's very unfortunate, but that's the case. And it has always been, I would say, quite difficult for American businesses, for many American businesses, to succeed in Russia, although, of course, there are other examples, but, you know, examples, they don't make kind of large flows and large billion-dollar numbers. And now with the sanctions, of course, that's even more difficult. There was much, at least for a period of time, there was a lot of involvement by U.S. firms in Russian financial markets. But that is something that I think essentially is coming to a halt because of the sanctions. So again, that's part of today's environment and something we need to recognize.
Picking up on that sanctions theme, John, if you could maybe just weigh in. I mean, we have elections coming up in Germany and in France in 2017, and there have been murmurings in the German government, of course, that, you know, maybe sanctions, releasing some of those sanctions on Russia would play well with the domestic audience at home. Is that component of that transatlantic partnership vis-a-vis Russia, the West vis-a-vis Russia, going to hold?
Well, I think if the new administration wants to continue the sanctions policy as an effective tool of economic coercion against Russia, it needs to stay linked to the Europeans in the way the Obama administration has successfully pursued this policy up until now. The only reason that sanctions have had an effect, and President Putin himself this year finally admitted that they are having a big effect on the Russian economy, although I agree with Maxim, the bigger hit comes from oil prices. The problem gets into details of the Minsk process and Ukraine, but to shorten it, I'd say the level of terpilivost. I can't think of the word in English. Yeah, I can't think of the word in English.
Patience?
Patience. The patience that the Europeans. That's an okay the patience. I'm used to hearing this argued on the Russian side. The patience that the Europeans have had for this is wearing out. They're suffering from sanctions fatigue, and they may go to a different mode of looking at implementation of the Minsk agreements to allow them, on a kind of step-by-step basis, to loosen some of the sanctions. If that happens, the United States is going to be hard-pressed either to join that or to break away. And breaking away will disadvantage American companies in the way that you described. So that's a huge dilemma that's going to face a new administration very early, because the Europeans are likely by January or February of next year to begin to loosen their own sanctions.
Yeah. My colleague Matt Bunn gets the last question.
Hi, I'm Matthew Bunn. I'm
Hey,
a
Matt.
professor of practice here at this school. By the way, in answer to Professor Boyko's question, I could give you a long list of specific nuclear actions they're doing that are quite worrisome, but that's not the point of my
He was
question.
the guy I was referring to when I said, I know there's someone here.
So you're an economist. I'd like to hear more about what the Kremlin could do to lay the basis for a growing economy in Russia, short and long term, and how much difference it would actually make if there was enough of a resolution of the Ukraine crisis to get rid of some of the U.S. and European sanctions, or maybe all of the U.S. and European sanctions. Would that be a big part of a strong economic plan, or a modest part, or and what would a good economic plan for Russia, given where it is now, look like?
Well, I think there is a big difference between what Kremlin could do and what it would do. I think that it looks like in the current situation, actually I have to say that part of the current economic policies have been done very well. I'm particularly talking about in this difficult environment for the Russian economy of falling oil prices and sanctions, of the way that the currency regime has been managed, the kind of the fiscal policy. Not going into too many details, I think that has been done right, but that does not lead to growth. And it looks that at the moment, Russian economy is stuck in a situation where to start growing again, there has to be pretty fundamental reforms in the areas, let's say, of how property rights are handled, in the areas of how certain sectors have to be privatized, or the increasing involvement of state corporations and their role has to be curtailed, etc. And these are things that are very costly or risky politically. I certainly would not expect that to be happening. On the sanctions side, look, I think that there is an important interplay between oil and sanctions. I think that with the oil price going down, the big hit was actually for the Russian budget. And given very low Russian foreign debt, that sort of theoretically creates a room for a lot of borrowing. But this is actually where sanctions can and seem to be putting a hard stop. At least the program that Russia tried to do this year to raise international funding did not go very well, and I think that sanctions were a big contributor to that. So it's for U.S. kind of administration, current or future, to decide what the future path should be. But I would not underestimate the effect of sanctions on the economy. Having said all that, of course, there is a factor that it's very hard to predict, which is the price of oil. I think what I've been saying, I don't have a kind of a better forecast for the price of oil than what you would read in newspapers. But assuming that it's, what I was saying was sort of assuming that the price of oil stays where it is. But it may well be the case that, the economic policy is, let's just wait it out. It will start growing at some point. Who knows?
So I think what this evening's discussion richly proves is that in this particular relationship, symbolic politics matter. They matter maybe more than in some other relationships that we have with other, specifically the United States has with other parts of this world. But real politics matters just as well. I mean, we've talked about the areas of possible collaboration. We didn't get into the success that was the Iran nuclear negotiation. Jill mentioned with an asterisk the space program, but again, they're areas in which we have lots of practical collaboration ongoing, and there are numerous touch points which we addressed with respect to the nuclear issue, but I think other things that could eventually emerge on a single table between whoever is elected on November 8th in this country and Vladimir Putin, whom he or she will certainly meet on the other side. I want to thank the three panelists for a very frank discussion, an animated discussion. I want to thank you for your excellent questions. Please join me in thanking our panelists.